You left Russia in 2013, and now you have been officially added to the Russian government list of terrorists and extremists.
If you want prosperity for Russia, if you want economic growth for Russia, you need opening up the economy. So if Putin is gone before 2035, that would be a scenario which in Britain is best described by the movie Death of Stalin. Mm-hmm. This is a comedy which is actually banned in Russia.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm Daniel Freeman. Today we'll be discussing the economy of Russia, from the rise of Vladimir Putin to the war in Ukraine. To do so, I'm delighted to be joined by one of the best people in the world to discuss this topic, Dr. Sergei Guriev. In addition to being a prolific economist, Sergey has had a long and varied career both inside and outside of Russia. He was the rector of the new economic school in Moscow, an informal economic advisor to Dmitri Medvedev, the chief economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the provost of Sciences Po, the dean of the London Business School, and also most recently a terrorist, at least according to the Russian government. So that's quite a varied career. Thank you so much for joining us, Sergey.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for inviting me.
Yeah. So before we get into the economics of Putin's Russia, I thought we'd get some personal background. So the obvious question is, 15 years ago, you were, a respected academic in Russia. You were advising Dmitri Medvedev on economic policy. You had a weekly column in Vedomosti, which is one of Russia's leading business papers. You left Russia in 2013, and now you have been officially added to the Russian government list of terrorists and extremists. How did you manage to get from point A to point B?
Thank you, Daniel. Indeed, it's a long story. Together with a number of other, at that point, young Russian economists, we came back from the West, mostly from the United States. And we thought that Russia needs an excellent economics institution which would train new generations of economists for Russian academia, public and private sector. And this is what New Economic School was. It was established before we came back. It was established in 1992 and initially sent people to do their PhD abroad in the US, but also in the UK and other advanced centers of economic thought. Some of these people started to come back after their PhDs. In late 1990s, and so New Economic School attempted to be the most advanced center of economic research and postgraduate teaching in that part of the world, and it was growing, I would say, successfully. And of course, we also wanted to contribute to public policy advice. I've never worked for the government, neither in Medvedev years or Putin years. But as you rightly said, I had regular op-eds in leading newspapers and magazines. I've also spoken on various occasions trying to provide advice, which eventually has not been listened to. But at least at that point, and you correctly said, things have changed. At that point, you had freedom to speak about those issues. As an honest scholar, I would say at that point that if you want prosperity for Russia, if you want economic growth for Russia, you need opening up the economy, integration with the European and more generally Western economies, bringing foreign direct investment in Russia, reforming governance, fighting corruption. And of course, what eventually has happened in Russia, especially after Vladimir Putin coming back to presidential office in 2012, was the opposite of that. And that eventually resulted in my falling out with Vladimir Putin. I also thought that, for example, Alexei Navalny's crusade against corruption was very important, not just for Russia becoming a free political space, but also for economic prosperity. And at that point, I was also advising Alexei Navalny. And again, it tells you something about how Russia has changed. Could openly talk to Navalny in favor and support of Navalny, and at the same time, I would go to meetings with Vladimir Putin or Dmitri Medvedev. I was a member of the board of big government companies, including the largest bank, Sberbank, where I was a board member for 6 years. But then in 2012, Vladimir Putin came back. Repression has intensified. And at some point, people told me that I shouldn't be in Russia. I've been interrogated, my emails have been confiscated, my office was searched, and common friends said that Vladimir Putin doesn't appreciate what I say. So I bought a one-way ticket and left. And then as an academic, I became a professor in France first, and as you rightly said, I worked for European Bank for Reconstruction and Development here in London as a chief economist. Then I came back to France. All this time, I was supporting pro-democratic Russian forces, including Alexei Navalny, with whom I remained in touch until those very tragic events of 2024. But then, increasingly, Russian government expressed their dislike for me. I was announced foreign agent in 2023, but as you rightly said, I was announced as terrorist. I was designated as terrorist this fall. Now, this is something which is actually quite interesting. Since you're asking these questions, I have an answer for you. So the answer is very simple. In 2022, Council of Europe kicked out Russia for a good reason. But Council of Europe was always interested in bringing Russian citizens, Russian society in. And we talked with the leadership of Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe, in particular with the President of Parliamentary Assembly, how Council of Europe can actually bring Russian civil society into its halls in Strasbourg or Paris. And that's exactly what started in the fall of 2022. Actually, vividly remember the first meeting with the President of Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe in the fall of 2022 in my office in Paris, for that matter. And we worked very hard for a few years. Eventually, especially when I moved to London, I got disconnected from this process, but I was part of this process, and I think it's great that in October 2025, Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe eventually voted to welcome a group of Russian civil society, mostly political exiles, to the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe as observers. There is now a platform for collaboration with Russian opposition, and I think it's very useful. And this is what probably offended Vladimir Putin, because essentially this move by the Council of Europe says, you, Vladimir Putin, you are not a legitimate government of Russia. These are the people who actually represent Russia. I'm no longer part of this movement, but I think it's very important that Council of Europe actually spoke very clearly to Vladimir Putin that there is a group of Russians that we think are the real Russia, the true Russia, if you like.
Right, and that was the step that was sort of transition from you being someone who...
Just a foreign agent to a real terrorist. So the accusation is we are trying to seize and retain power in Russia by force.
Right.
That's the literary accusation. I'm a very peaceful person. I'm a professor. I don't own any weapons, but this is the accusation.
Well, we were saying this before we started, that I think you are the first person designated as a terrorist by any country that we've had in the podcast studio.
There is always a first.
Yeah, so it's quite an achievement. So, on to Russia more broadly. So, Vladimir Putin comes to power in 2000 as president, but the broader context of this is that the Soviet Union obviously falls in 1991. We have an incredibly economically unstable period in the 1990s in Russia. Why were the 1990s such a tough time for the Russian economy?
Well, the initial conditions were not great. Soviet economy was not a market economy. There were many distortions. Soviet Union also went bankrupt. We should not forget that the Gorbachev government made many mistakes, borrowed a lot of money abroad, did not reform immediately. It was very hard, I should say, for Gorbachev's government to understand what needs to be done. Today, with a hindsight, we know a lot more about how to reform countries like this and economies like that. But it was much harder for Soviet Union. Defense sector was much bigger. Fiscal pressures were much larger than, say, in Poland, for that matter. And at some point, you still have Gorbachev tried to raise income levels and therefore printed money to pay higher wages, but you don't raise prices, so you had huge shortages. So that was a big upheaval that already resulted in decline in GDP before Soviet Union deteriorated and disintegrated. People sometimes say that it was the collapse of the Soviet Union that resulted in economic decline. But actually, data suggests that decline started before 1992. And then the Soviet Union went bankrupt. Russia started with a huge external debt. And also the government made quite a few mistakes as well. Did not manage to bring inflation down quickly. That resulted in additional prolongation of the crisis. And then the Russian government was also very unlucky that at the time the economy started to recover, there was the Asian crisis, oil prices collapsed, and Russia, today it's very hard to imagine that, but Russia was facing oil prices of about $10 per barrel, right? So today when we talk about how Russia is suffering because oil prices are below 60, at that point it was 10, which even in today's prices is a very low price. So Russia had a budget crisis, it defaulted on its debt, and again, I can go on and on, but there were many mistakes made in the 1990s, and there was a general feeling that we need stability, we need stabilization. Many reforms, which eventually were carried out in 1990s, helped Vladimir Putin to relaunch economic growth in his first term, but he managed to come exactly at the right point when the economy was at its lowest. Ruble was at its weakest, and thus protecting Russian industry from external competition. Debt was written off, and then oil prices started to recover. And so when Vladimir Putin was appointed as prime minister in the summer of 1999, people still didn't know that, but the Russian economy already started to recover. And so he appropriated the credit for this, and with that credit, of course, he got all the popularity and approval.
Yeah. Why was the Yeltsin government never able to really get control of inflation?
So again, there was a lack of understanding of where inflation is coming from. The pro-market ministers, which were part of Yeltsin's government, never actually had a control of the central bank until mid-1990s, and that's when they managed to bring inflation down. Yeltsin built his government as a coalition where he had a central bank which felt we need to support the industry, industrial ministers who also said we need to print money to support us. There was also an energy lobby that was against market prices for energy. So there was a lot of lobbying, partial reforms, corruption going on. And one of the things that people usually blame the pro-reform government of 1992 and 1993 is actually something that this government could not do, because they did not control monetary policy, they didn't control industrial ministries. And until mid-1990s, that was not done. Then inflation started to come down, and as I said, unfortunately, then it turned out that Russian government could not collect taxes because it was a general lack of trust and confidence in the government. Companies did not pay taxes. Then Russian government started to borrow domestically, which was also a huge mistake. There was this GKO market, the short-term treasury bonds in rubles, and since Russian government was running a huge deficit in that period, interest rates on those bonds were very high. And it was a Ponzi scheme which had to blow up at some point, and it did, especially because oil prices went down. But also what these high interest rates did, they also crowded out cash from the industrial sector. If you have rubles, you invest in those bonds because interest rates are so high. And so in inter-firm payments, you would have domination of barter, all kinds of IOUs, all kinds of non-monetary payment systems. So it was really chaos, eventually driven by the fact that the government could not run a balanced budget.
Yeah. You mentioned that the ministers in Yeltsin's government didn't really have, people like Gaidar and Chubais didn't really have control of the central bank. Was this an issue of lack of will on Yeltsin's part? Could he have not just said to the Russian central bank that, look, you need to stop printing all this money?
So Yeltsin was a person who indeed brought different people to his government. He had a lot of respect for this guy, Gerashchenko, who was just brought up in Soviet Union, who had limited understanding of monetary economics, and thought that if we print money, give this money to industry. Industry will grow somehow, prices will come down. This is what we still see in some countries. We saw a lot of that in Latin America in the second half of 20th century. But let me not name countries now, but we still have countries where presidents fire central bankers and say, we need to print more money. That will actually bring the prices down. You can even say that a lot of thinkers who identify themselves with modern monetary theory, which went out of fashion recently, but it was very fashionable a few years ago, would say you can print as much money as you want, there will be no inflation. So that was just, I would say, a lack of sufficient economic orthodoxy in the government. And Yeltsin, I guess, just trusted Soviet-era thinkers and didn't fully understand that, for example, the central bank should be also run by people who understand modern economics.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because often what critics of markets more broadly will use Russia in the 1990s as an example of, oh, look, you introduced markets, you introduced capitalism, and this caused a complete collapse. What you're saying is that there wasn't enough orthodoxy.
Absolutely.
Basically. Yeah.
I think I mentioned Poland. If you ask the author of Polish reforms, Leszek Balcerowicz, today, what went wrong in Poland? What did you would you do anything differently? He would say, I would actually move faster. And indeed, when you have a distorted economy, if you prolong the distortions, you just lose output that could have been used for raising incomes. When you have more inflation, it undermines investment, of course. If you have macroeconomic instability, that undermines economic recovery. And so what Poland did, they did move faster. They did eliminate those distortions, and suddenly the growth has restarted quite quickly. And Poland has been an economic growth champion for a few decades.
Yeah.
And the other example would probably be Ukraine in 1990s. In the beginning of 1990s, Poland and Ukraine had the same level of GDP per capita. Before the full-scale invasion 2022, I think the difference in income per capita would be 3 times. So that kind of tells you that economic orthodoxy actually works and delivers growth. And Poland now, like Slovenia, like Czech Republic, like Slovakia, are high-income economies.
Yeah. Do you think going down a Polish route was ever going to be a viable political strategy for someone like Yeltsin? Because as I understand it, one of the things that made the Polish model work was you had a high degree of fiscal austerity that many Russian commentators thought was never going to be viable in Russia, simply because the government didn't have the same high level of legitimacy that the new democratic Polish government had.
So this is a great question. Actually, I wrote a review of a book mostly about Gorbachev. There's a very good book by Chris Miller called The Struggle to Save the Soviet Economy. The book, I think, came out in 2016, and my review came out in Journal of Economic Literature in 2019, where the book discusses Gorbachev challenges and mistakes. And in that review, I also talk about post-Gorbachev government's mistakes. And I think one of the biggest mistakes of that government was failure to explain to Russian society how bad things are and how much austerity is actually needed. And that austerity eventually came, because if you don't have money, you don't have money. And if you prolong the distortions and undermine economic recovery, then you have even less money.
Yeah,
and
you just have more pieces of paper.
Exactly. And in real terms, austerity is actually even more painful if you delay market mechanisms to help economic recovery. And one of those challenges was indeed that the Russian government didn't want to, or it wasn't able to communicate to Russian people, explaining that unfortunately we need to buy the bullet, we need to introduce austerity. This austerity just happened on its own because the Russian government, as I said, had a major challenge collecting taxes. And then the other issue, of course, was there was corruption, which also undermined the public's confidence in the government and unwillingness to pay taxes. So that was also an important issue. And corruption may happen in market and non-market economies, with the exception that in non-market economies or distorted economies, you have more opportunities for rent seeking. If you have multiple price levels for the same good, for example, if export price for Russian oil is different from domestic price for Russian oil, this is a great opportunity for corruption. And if you have not privatized this industry, there is an opportunity for stealing from the state enterprise. So in that sense, of course, corruption may happen in the market economy. And of course, in Russia in the 1990s, Russia was a more marketized economy, better marketized economy than Soviet economy, but still was a very distorted economy, and corrupt bureaucrats used every opportunity to steal.
Yeah. You've said in the past that the newly established Russian Federation should have just immediately defaulted on all Soviet debt. Why would that have helped?
I think it was the right way to go. Imagine that you lend to Maduro's government today. You've probably seen that sometimes democratically elected opposition leaders in Venezuela would say, look, we are not going to pay this debt. This government doesn't represent us. You lend it to the government, which uses this money for wrong purposes. And I was born in Soviet Union, but Soviet government did not represent me. And I think it was a great opportunity to write off this debt, especially the debt given to Gorbachev in the latest years of Soviet Union. I should say that in early 1980s, the Soviet government ran a balanced budget. Gorbachev, understanding that he needs to build legitimacy and approval from the people because he had to fight the insiders. So he did print a lot of money, raised a lot of salaries, and of course that created shortages. He didn't fully understand the implications of printing more money in an economy with fixed prices. And to pay those expenditure, he also borrowed a lot internationally until the world understood that Soviet Union is never going to repay this debt. Now, Poland has restructured the debt and written off half of the debt. And I think that was a very important contributor to Polish government's ability to reform. And I think the Soviet Union left Russia, settled Russia with its debt, which was not legitimate and should have not been paid back. Post-Soviet Russia actually even recognized Tsarist debt. So, and I think much of that was a mistake. I think this fiscal pressure that Yeltsin's government inherited simply by recognizing this debt was just undermining the fiscal equilibrium and capacity to reform.
Why didn't Yeltsin want to default on this debt? Why did, in fact, I understand it, I think they ultimately ended up taking on pretty much all of the Soviet Union's debt, whereas there was initially an idea that they'd take 60% and Ukraine would get 15% and so on and so forth.
So for Yeltsin, it was also very important to be a successor to Soviet Union. In particular, this deal also meant that Russia gets all the foreign assets, but also all the liabilities and nuclear weapons. And that was a very important part of the equation. But I think the West should have offered restructuring of Soviet debt, should have also offered a much more massive support of the reforms akin to Marshall Plan in 1940s and 50s in post-war Europe, which was initially not offered to Germany, but eventually Germany was included into the Marshall Plan, which I think was a fundamental factor in making Germany more successful, democratic Germany that we see today. Now, you can say that Russia was welcome into International Monetary Fund, World Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, but the magnitudes were not still there.
How would you respond to someone, say, a politician at the time in a Western country saying, well, look, Russia is far, far more corrupt in the mid-1990s than, say, West Germany was in the late 1940s, 1950s. And so if we had just thrown lots of money into Russia, it would have all just ended up in various people's Swiss bank accounts.
That's a great question, and there are mechanisms, of course, to monitor the spending, and the World Bank and EBRD have those mechanisms. And for sure, there is always a risk like this, and you need to invest effort in monitoring the spending. And a lot of people, when you look in what happened in 1998, a lot of people are still asking questions what happened with the lending from the IMF. I don't think there was a foul play, actually, in that particular case, but there are always questions about lending to corrupt countries, and Russia is not an exception. There are many corrupt countries around the world where you have exactly this. When you lend to those countries, you suddenly see increase in Swiss bank accounts of officials in those countries. But yes, it was a bet that the West should have taken. There is a book about Gaidar's revolution written by two of his colleagues in 2015, where actually this question is raised and discussed by former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt. So he wrote introduction to this book, and he says the West just didn't have bandwidth to think about those issues. The West was thinking about saving Latin American countries. In the US, you had an election, and the power was moving from Bush to Clinton. Germany was busy with reunification. Japan didn't like to support Russia, which didn't want to negotiate the Kuril Islands, and all kinds of stuff like this. And basically, the amounts were not there because Western leadership was busy.
Yeah. Okay, so Putin comes to power when, as you put it, Russia in some sense is at its economic nadir. Now, some of the reasonably impressive economic growth you get between 2000 and 2008 is down to things like increased oil prices. But I think you've said in the past that there were actually significant market reforms that actually helped the Russian economy quite a bit. What were some of those reforms and why were they so important?
Right. So some reforms already took place in the 1990s. Some legal changes have been made before Putin came to power. But then Putin came to power understanding that Russia needs economic growth. And his advisors, most importantly, Hermann Greff, told him that you need pro-market reforms if you want to relaunch growth. And he said, sure. And there was this 10-year program written by Greff and his colleagues, which foresaw major deregulation efforts, macroeconomic stabilization, which was very important, which of course was much easier to do when oil prices are high. There was a very important land reform, introducing market for private land.
Yeah. Arguably for the first time in Russian history.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct. There was general liberalization of currency regimes. Ruble became convertible currency. There was a tax reform, bringing tax rates down from top marginal rates of something like 30 or 35% to 13%. Now, why did the reformers choose 13 flat rate? Because that's exactly what Russia was able to collect. With all the high taxes of 20, 30, or 35%, the actual intake was 13%. And they said, let's set at 13, but flat, and so we don't have tax evasion. And that actually helped to raise tax revenue, and Russia did stabilize the budget. Moreover, Russia started to record budget surpluses and paid off the debt eventually, and started to accumulate the sovereign fund. There were reforms which allowed for competition in the banking sector. So before that time, only state banks had a de facto deposit insurance. Introduction of modern deposit insurance and prudential regulation allowed for private banks to compete. And private banks came to the market, also introduced retail lending. Mortgage markets started to appear, which is extremely important, of course.
And there weren't mortgage markets before this in Russia?
Pretty much none, because inflation was high, and there was a very short-term horizon, right? So, and then indeed, as you rightly said, if you look at the growth between 1999 and 2007, this is the fastest growth decade in Russian history, only comparable to the 1920s new economic policy, which was kind of pro-market policy until Stalin turned his back on pro-market policies and changed into collectivization and industrialization. So Russian economy grew at about 7% per year, therefore pretty much doubling income per capita. And of course, at that point, people were extremely happy. Putin was very popular. Interestingly, sometime in 2002 and 2003, Putin suddenly understood that he doesn't need to reform further because oil prices are so high that he doesn't need further fighting corruption, reforming corrupt institutions, decentralizing government and public institutions. And the turning point was sometime in 2002, where he said no to reforming Gazprom. So the program of reforms included reforming Gazprom, and Putin said no. That's a good thing to have a state-owned monopoly.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the bigger publicly known fact is the arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky in the fall of 2003. Now, the growth still continued. About half of this growth, we have a chapter in the book with Oleg Tsevinsky, who's now professor at Yale, which quantifies these factors, and basically half of the growth was indeed due to growth in oil prices, and half roughly to reforms.
Yeah. Well, that's in itself quite a remarkable achievement. If Britain was able to have 3.5% growth, just down to economic reforms, that would be quite impressive. I suppose Russia was starting from a lower base.
Absolutely. When you start from a lower base, it's easier to grow faster.
Yeah, you get catch-up growth. You mentioned the prosecution of Khodorkovsky, and you also in this period have tense relationships with many of the oligarchs who had become wealthy in the 1990s. Does that not create a less favourable business environment, or is the sort of view that this is only affecting a very small number of people and that the broader economic environment is actually getting more friendly to business?
Yes and no. So what Putin did when he came to power, he said to oligarchs, you do business, you don't do politics. I'm in charge of politics. And he viewed Khodorkovsky's work in early 2000s as breaking this pact, because Khodorkovsky supported various political parties, especially around this election in 2003, and Putin decided to send a signal that you cannot do that. You cannot break our pact. And all others got the message and never stood up to Putin. So Khodorkovsky was this summary execution which sends a signal to everybody else. Now, what happened next was those so-called oligarchs actually got richer because oil price continued to grow. Business for them was great. Foreign direct investment was coming in. Russians got higher and higher incomes. So what didn't work well, though, is when you have this corrupt system, you build crony capitalism where big business is doing well, but small business doesn't grow. Innovative business doesn't grow. I had this interesting conversation with Vladimir Putin. We had a World Economic Forum meeting in Moscow in 2001, and I asked him a question. I was in the audience. I asked him a question. What is going to happen to Russia in 2010? And Putin said, we will be happy. That's exactly what he said, right? And I also had a puzzled look. What does it mean, happy?
Yeah.
Now I understand that the main question should have been we. Who are we? Who will be happy?
Yeah.
And now you can actually define Putin, his friends, some of the oligarchs. But then in 2010, when this year came, I was also on stage with Putin in an economic forum. It was in Sochi, his favorite region of Russia. And I asked him, look, going back 10 years, how much of your plans have you actually implemented and delivered? And he said, pretty much I've done everything I wanted to do, except we've not diversified the economy. The Russian economy remained dependent on oil and gas. And the reason for that is very simple. If you want to grow oil and gas business, you don't need good business climate. Oil companies can exist in all kinds of environments. As long as you can import the state-of-the-art technology from the West, then things are fine. Now, if you want to grow small business, knowledge-intensive, innovative business, that's where you need good institutions. Rule of law, good human capital institutions, universities, research environment, intellectual property rights, financial system which is competitive, stock market which is very much dependent on rule of law, right? The whole ecosystem of innovation needs something like US or UK rule of law. And this is what he didn't want to do because rule of law threatens rulers like Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
And so whether this choice was conscious or unconscious, he didn't do that. Russian economy was growing, but it was not growing through innovative businesses.
Yeah. If I were to ask you to sort of look into the mind of Vladimir Putin, do you think it is conscious in the sense that is he actively thinking if we rebalance our economy towards services, towards knowledge economy or high-tech industry, that will somewhere down the line lead to, demands for more constitutional rule, for the rule of law, for democratization, that sort of thing?
I think it's not how he thinks, but at every turning point when he sees that there is a demand for more representation, which happened in 2011 and 2012 when people took to the street, he was very upset.
Yeah. The Bolotnaya
protests. When people saw the actual middle class, Moscow middle class, saw that elections are blatantly stolen, Putin understood that we need to crush those protests because they are actually threatening me staying in power. And running honest elections is against me. And so demands for honest elections and fighting corruption, and exactly that was the crusade of Alexei Navalny, that is against me.
Yeah.
And so he made those choices. He said, you can ask, but you will not be granted your wish, and I'll put you in jail.
Yeah.
Or further even kill you.
Yeah. So actually, the Bolotnaya protests take place in this interesting period in Russian history from 2008 to 2012, where Putin, honoring his constitutional requirement, steps down as president, becomes prime minister, and Dmitri Medvedev comes to power. Is there any transition in policy under Medvedev that goes beyond rhetoric? And actually, what is the rhetorical change from the first Putin period to Medvedev?
So it's a great question. So it's also what you just said about first Putin period is a great question, because before 2008, Putin already had 2 terms, right? So, and those 2 terms were very different. In the first term, he was very pro-Western. And in the second term, he already gave this Munich speech where he actually criticized the West and especially the United States very harshly. But the rhetoric indeed changed in the sense that Medvedev said, we need to fight corruption, we need to be more transparent, we need to partner with Europe. Literally, there was a discussion about visa-free regime, travel regime between Europe and Russia. FDI was welcome in Russia. And in some cases, there were real reforms in terms of becoming more transparent, fighting corruption, improving corporate governance, including corporate governance in government companies. And there was a real partnership with the United States to the extent, I'm not kidding, that NATO had it's based in Ulyanovsk, in one of the cities inside of Russia, because Americans thought this would be logistically easier to support our operation in Afghanistan. So American troops were in Russia, and everybody was happy.
By the Russian government.
By the Russians, yes. And that was completely normal. And that was the time of this reset. And Russia was eventually joining WTO, right, which was a very important move, and was on track to join OECD. And by 2013, Russia actually became a high-income country. Much of that was due to oil, but some transparency and anti-corruption efforts also helped.
Yeah. I mean, Medvedev also had this big campaign against what he called legal nihilism. What exactly does that mean, and did it have any teeth?
Legal nihilism means disregard for rule of law. So Medvedev was talking about how we need to respect the rule of law. Now, what we now know is that he himself was very corrupt. And this has actually happened in 2017 when Alexei Navalny published his investigation into Medvedev himself. And we discovered that by the time Medvedev was talking about legal nihilism, he already built a lot of palaces funded through very corrupt tools. And this shocked people so much that a lot of people took to the street in 2017 in much more repressive climate, but they could not just tolerate the level of corruption they saw in that investigation. I think at that point, 2017 investigation identified real estate jointly worth $1 billion. And at that point, Medvedev was not an important person in Russia. And yet, the fact that even this relatively unimportant person accumulated so many palaces shocked the Russians. But the rhetoric was in favor of rule of law.
Yeah. Do you think it was ever on some level, even though hypocritical, do you think it was sincere? Did Medvedev actually think that Russia needed to reform more against corruption, reform even politically in some sense? if it wanted to maintain a high level of growth.
So now we know that he was very corrupt himself.
Yeah.
And I think that was the hook for Putin to blackmail Medvedev himself. I think this was a very important tool which Putin used to kick out Medvedev in 2012. But you could also see a political strategy behind modernization, liberalization in those years from 2008 to 2012, which you could see that there was an electorate, there was a constituency in favor of liberalization and pro-market reforms. These are the people who took to the street in 2011. And Medvedev could think that I cannot appeal to Putin's constituencies of KGB officers, but I could try to appeal to this new pro-business generation, pro-market generations, the beneficiaries of market reforms. And in that sense, even being corrupt himself, he could have seen a route to retaining power after 2012 by building a critical mass of people who could have supported him. But again, from what we know now, it looks like that would never be a viable strategy because Putin could always expose him and blackmail him.
Right, and so Medvedev ultimately decides to stand down in 2012. On the topic of, you have these protests, the Bolotnaya protest most prominently, but one interesting question that has particularly been raised since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine is, why was it that no, even quite authoritarian presidents in Ukraine have ever been able to establish a Putin-style system there? Why is it that you had sort of two successful revolutions in 21st century Ukraine, the Orange Revolution in 2004 and the Maidan in 2014, and yet Russia never had the same thing? What's the difference here?
Well, Russia inherited the repression apparatus. The KGB was always stationed in Moscow, right? So and Putin was just more competent in repression, more competent in running the country. If you think about this, in Belarus again, civil society was very pro-European, has always been very pro-European. But again, Lukashenko, who is not an international grandmaster in chess or rocket science, right, still managed to suppress the opposition and has always been very brutal and managed to stay in power. And in Ukraine, no government has managed to build this repression apparatus and suppress the opposition and civil society. Sometimes you can attribute it to luck, that some of those pro-authoritarian presidents were not just competent in building those machines. In some cases, people who you would accuse of corruption would still want to be part of Europe rather than Russia. In that part of the world, the choice is you may be corrupt and authoritarian, and if you suppress your opposition by force, you are no longer welcome in Europe, so you become dependent on Russia. And there is a choice. You may limit repression and be part of European sphere of influence, if you like, European attractivity space, European space. And this is what Ukrainian presidents eventually decided to do.
Yeah. Okay, so Putin comes back to power as president in 2012, and he's remained in place since. In foreign policy terms, he's a lot more suspicious about the West than he had been in his first two terms. Does this transfer into his attitude to foreign business as well, or is it focused just on foreign policy?
Mostly foreign policy. So Putin's view of foreign direct investment is very cynical. In a sense, he says, you are doing business in this part of the world and that part of the world. So if you're a big foreign company, come talk to me, we'll make a deal. It's very pragmatic in that respect. He would still sometimes expropriate foreign investors, especially when it benefits his close friends. But overall, he would be very pragmatic and non-ideological. On the anti-Western sentiment, I think what is important to bear in mind is the Arab Spring of 2011, where Putin deeply believed, and I think he still believes that the West actually instigated the Arab Spring. And this is why he was so unhappy about Medvedev not using his veto power against bombing Libya. So there was a no-flight zone voted in the UN Security Council. Russia, as a permanent member, could have vetoed it. Medvedev did not, and it was actually a public disagreement on TV between Putin and Medvedev in 2011, which I think was eventually what led to Medvedev's downfall. But Putin strongly believed that it was not were not the people who stood against the authoritarian rulers in the Middle East and North Africa, but American instigators.
Yeah. One of the things that Mikhail Zyga suggests in his very good book, All the Kremlin's Men, was that Putin was particularly badly affected by the lynching of Gaddafi by rebel forces, and he basically saw it as, oh, this could be me. This is what the West wants for me.
One of the things I remember resulted in my in Putin's growing discontent regarding my own public speeches. At some point, I was asked about the Arab Spring. It was August 2012, I would say. And I say, look, different Arab leaders did different things. Some fled, some fought, some killed the opposition. And actually, if you look at how they ended up, people who handed over power in a peaceful way, maybe in exile, but enjoying life.
Yeah.
And people who fought to the bitter end sometimes got lynched. And actually, if you look at 5 or 6 rulers in North Africa at that point, some of them actually reformed the governance system and remained in power. Some fled, some got killed, some went to jail. So.
Yeah.
Putin disliked that.
Yeah.
Putin disliked that speech.
Yeah. Slight tangent, but do you think there was a kind of utilitarian case for allowing dictators to flee into exile, not hunting them down and trying to take them to international courts because it encourages them not to fight on?
That's always a question versus ex ante, regarding ex ante versus ex post decisions. Ex ante, we want to tell the dictators, if you break international law, we'll punish you. But once the law is already broken, indeed, as you rightly say, maybe letting dictators flee saves lives.
Yeah.
And this I think is a normal thing when you negotiate with terrorists who hold hostages. Sometimes you have to take the route which is a lesser evil, saving lives at the cost of letting perpetrators go unpunished.
Yeah. So another big transition point in Russia's history and in Putin's time in power was the Maidan revolution in Ukraine and Russia's annexation of Crimea, the war in the Donbass. This is triggered, the Maidan revolution is essentially triggered by a series of trade negotiations between Ukraine and the EU, and then Yanukovych, president of Ukraine, and Russia. How much of Putin's concerns about Ukraine signing the proposed deal they had with the EU was economic, and how much is that just a pretext?
So Putin understood that this also signifies not just economic integration, but political integration. And of course, Putin says that we don't want NATO to be in Ukraine. We don't want Ukraine to join NATO. And of course, this negotiation was about EU, not NATO. And it was, as you rightly said, economic, not even political. And of course, at that point, Ukraine, in its constitution, said we are a neutral country. We cannot join NATO. But Putin used this pretext nonetheless. Overall, for Putin, what was not acceptable is successful, economically prosperous Ukraine that chose Europe over Russia. And the reason for that was very simple. Putin didn't like what happened in Georgia when corruption was eradicated by President Saakashvili, because it gave an example to Russians that you can actually eradicate corruption. So this narrative that Russia will always be corrupt, so Putin is not a bad guy, was false. But Georgia, Putin would say, is a small country. Georgians are different people. But Ukrainians, as Putin said, are very similar to Russians.
Yeah.
So if Russians are supposed to be corrupt always, and Ukrainians somehow manage to eradicate corruption, start economic growth, join EU, that is a really bad message to Russians in Russia who would understand if Ukrainians can do it, why can't we?
Yeah. It shows there is an alternative kind of thing. So Russia annexes Crimea, which actually on some level tilts Ukraine more towards Europe, because you've got a region that is sort of heavily populated by people who are more sympathetic to Russia than the average in Ukraine. Did he just sort of not think about the risk that you're going to turn the rest of Ukraine further towards the West, or did he just sort of discount it?
No, I think he discounted this risk, and it was important for him to show to his base, to his constituency, that he is growing Russia. He's rebuilding the empire. And I should say that I was surprised, and I am sure that he was surprised how popular annexation of Crimea was. Genuinely, it turns out that Russians do have this imperial nostalgia, and apparently many of them were happy. Not everybody, but majority of Russians did rejoice when they saw that Russia is finally growing its territory. Russia is a big country. Russia doesn't need any more territory. And if you wanted to vacation in Crimea, you could before 2014 as well. But this narrative that Russia's always been besieged fortress, enemies always wanted to dismember Russia, and Russia always fought back, this narrative turned out to be very much entrenched, and annexation of Crimea was indeed popular. I should say that indeed in 1991, when Ukraine had a referendum on independence, every region of Ukraine voted in favor at the margin of something like 85-90%.
Yeah.
Crimea and Sevastopol voted in favor of independence, but in the range of 55 or 60%.
Yeah. So it was always sort of more, by the standards of Ukrainian regions, always tilted more towards Russia than, say, Lviv or somewhere like that.
But still, I think sometimes people don't pay enough attention how the annexation actually happened. Putin says, well, that was a free referendum. Crimeans actually voted in favor of joining Russia. But what actually happened, Putin's soldiers took over the parliament, forced the announcement of this referendum at a gunpoint, literally at a gunpoint, and then they carried out this referendum themselves. Yeah. So I think we should not forget that it was actual seizure of power by force, by Putin.
Okay. So in the aftermath of the annexation of Crimea, and then particularly the sending of volunteers to fight in the Donbass against the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian control, various sanctions are imposed on Russia, particularly by the EU and the United States. What economic impact do these have?
So the initial sanctions were quite limited, and the current estimates are something like in the first 5 years after 2014. I'm talking about 5 years because afterwards you had COVID and it was much harder to measure impact. But the first 5 years, it probably reduced Russian GDP by one percentage point, so 0.2 percentage points per year. In fact,
overall 1% lower than it otherwise would.
So it's not huge impact. It's not trivial. What is important, though, is in March, Putin annexes Crimea. Crimea becomes part of Russia in March 2014. Now, in later months, Putin starts talking about Novorossiya, which is 6 more regions. And then in August, US and EU start introducing harsher sanctions. And again, those sanctions are still very small relative to what we have today.
Yeah.
And yet it is clear that the West is actually more serious than Putin thought. And suddenly he stops talking about Novorossiya. He starts negotiating Minsk agreement, freezes the conflict, and never recognizes the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk until 2022, right? So those sanctions, even sanctions which were introduced in March, probably prevented Putin recognizing the elections, so-called elections, in May 2014 in Donetsk and Lugansk. I think sanctions matter. Sanctions bring perpetrators to the bargaining table. And even those literally very small sanctions, which we saw in 2014 in relative terms, changed Putin's behavior. He did not annex Donetsk and Lugansk. He annexed them de facto, but did not didn't recognize their independence or didn't made them part of Russia, and he didn't invade other 4 regions that he was talking about.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned obviously after 2019 you get COVID hitting Russia. What are the economic impacts of COVID in Russia, and also are there any political impacts?
So Putin used COVID to further repress opposition. During COVID, it was even harder to take to the street because Putin would say, "You are breaking the COVID regime, I'll put you in jail." Economically, Putin made a very conscious choice not to introduce strict lockdowns and also not to support Russian households financially. And so there are various estimates which suggest that this choice actually cost Russia a lot of lives.
Yeah.
Somewhere in the range of 1 million lives of excess mortality. So economically, Russian economy suffered but recovered reasonably quickly. But politically, some people would say that Putin himself, being paranoid about his own life, actually stayed isolated so long and under such a strict regime that he didn't talk to many people, and he became isolated and developed all those crazy ideas about Ukraine.
Yeah. This is the period when he starts writing or publishing under his name essays on the eternal unity of the Ukrainian and Russian people.
Exactly. So that's exactly the period. If you think about this, this is the major threat for any authoritarian regime, not getting independent feedback. And during this period, people who have to run a company, for example, cannot afford spending 2 weeks in a lockdown, in a confinement just to see Putin.
Yeah.
And so he only talks to people who have nothing to do. But
so
think
his
about
security details.
His security details, his friends from St. Petersburg. But if you run a real business, you cannot just quit your business for 2 weeks and sit and wait until Putin is happy to see you. So that was a huge selection of people who talked to him, and he developed those crazy ideas. Whether he actually had a brain impact, we don't know. But he definitely developed crazy ideas, and he didn't have pushback from people who have told him, "Look, it is actually a crazy idea. You are going to destroy Russia, not just Ukraine, if you invade." And this is, in that sense, COVID probably had a major impact.
Yeah. So in February 2022, Putin does order a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, obviously, militarily, the Russian army, to some extent, at least in the early stages of the war, seems to have underperformed what many analysts were expecting. Most analysts expected that ultimately the Russian army would be able to defeat the Ukrainian army reasonably quickly. But many analysts seem to have suggested that the economic damage would be from sanctions would be so devastating to Russia that the invasion would have to stop if it hadn't succeeded in a few months. Is it fair to say that the Russian army seems to have underperformed, but the economy has overperformed expectations?
Yes, you can say that. On the army side, probably the army was too corrupt, and Putin didn't fully realize because he didn't have independent feedback how corrupt the army is, how corrupt KGB is, because KGB promised to him a fifth column in Kiev, in Ukraine, which would rise and arrest or kill Ukrainian leadership, for example. United States also has helped Ukraine with intelligence data. One interesting turning point in this battle was this battle for Gostomel airfield, which is very close to Kiev, like several kilometers from Kiev. And the idea was to capture this airfield and bring plane loads of Russian elite paratroopers to that airfield and then capture Kiev. And apparently U.S. intelligence warned Ukrainians, and they managed to stand their ground. And that probably turned the course of the war. What I'm saying is it was actually quite close, if you think about this. Now, President Zelensky personal courage played a role where he refused to leave. I think it was also very, very important. But on the economic side, indeed, the West introduced a lot of sanctions against Russia, but some sanctions were delayed. Oil sanctions were actually delayed until December 2022. They were announced half a year before, which brought oil prices higher, but the West didn't have the courage to introduce a full oil embargo or whatever oil price cap, if you wish, until the end of 2022. And that, of course, gave Putin a lot of oil money in 2022. So the other factor, of course, is half the world has not joined sanctions. When we think about various dictatorial regimes, which are rogue regimes, usually the whole world sanctions them. And for example, Iran has been a target of many sanctions, but it's only in 2009 and 10 when Russia joined and China joined the sanctions regime. And this eventually brought Iran to a negotiation 2015. And again, Iran is a much smaller economy and was sanctioned by the whole world finally in 2010. But it still took a few years to bring Iranian regime to a deal, JCPOA, the so-called Iranian deal. So we should not have very high expectations. And again, when you say that Russian economy outperformed expectations, the question is also, why did we get those expectations? Where did we get these expectations from?
Are there any internal reasons to Russia? I mean, you mentioned that the sanctions regime hasn't been applied as fully across the world as many of us would like. But even so, Russia was previously a huge trading partner with the EU, and it has been to a very, very significant extent cut off from there. Are there any sort of internal sources of Russian economic resilience?
Well, it is a market economy still, so it can reallocate resources. It had also a sovereign wealth fund, and to a great extent, this fund supported expansion of the military economy. Overall, as I said, Russia benefited from high oil prices in 2022. Also, it switched to trade with China, and China has been an important provider of technology and the various resources that Russia couldn't have gotten in the EU or the US. Russia is an educated country, so it managed to build drone production reasonably quickly, initially relying on Iranian drones, but eventually building its own capacity and capability, which is now a very important factor in this war. And then macroeconomic policymakers did not make huge mistakes. So relative, for example, to Venezuela, right? Russian central bank and finance ministry have done a better job. Now, we just had a book published called The Failure, edited by Stephen Fisher and Harvey Baltzer, which talks about how Putin's regime in 21st century destroyed Russia. And this book opens with my chapter called The Failure of Putinomics. And I talk about all the issues we discussed today, but there is a section where I discuss pockets of efficiency. There are exceptions. There was a great company, Yandex, built in the tech space, and there are some other tech companies which were built, globally competitive tech companies, because Russia did have a lot of talent in mathematics, which converted into IT space. Sberbank has been a very successful and technologically advanced financial institution. And the other thing is central bank. Central bank built a meritocratic institution, bringing macroeconomic policy to the frontier of macroeconomic policy thinking in Russia before the invasion, bringing inflation under control. All of that also helped to resist sanctions and stabilize the economy after 2022.
Yeah. On the Russian central bank, it's Yevgenia Nabulina who's leading that, and by many accounts is sort of very competent by any standards, really. Why have so many sort of economic liberals, in some sense, seem to have stuck with the regime, while some have left? Obviously, you left. Anatoly Chubai's left, but Nabulina stayed. Why do you think that is?
So it's very hard for me to judge. I do know Elvira Nabiulina personally. She has worked in Putin's government on and off since the very beginning of Putin's presidential term, but pretty much non-stop since 2007 when she became a minister of the economy. Then she worked in the Kremlin presidential administration, central banker since 2013, and she always had a very high level of loyalty towards Putin. I'm pretty sure that she understands how catastrophic this war is for Russia, Russia's future, and the economy. And then the question is how she justifies what she's doing. I can see how she can tell herself somebody needs to fight inflation so poor Russians don't lose their incomes, purchasing power of their incomes. I'm sure she understands that by stabilizing the economy, she provides resources for this war and helps Putin to kill Ukrainians. There is another dimension which is not unimportant, which is people who have worked for Putin know that Putin is a very vindictive person who kills people who run away from him. And sometimes people who leave Putin's regime are at risk of losing their lives.
Yeah.
And so that could also be a factor. So, but I guess you should ask her, not me.
Yeah. Well, hopefully she can come on the podcast too. Obviously,
I'm pretty sure she's sanctioned. So.
Well, yeah, we'll have to do it over Zoom.
Yeah, exactly.
What are the big sort of strains of the war on the Russian economy? We've talked probably too much about how Russia has been able to resist sanctions better than expected, but it is having serious impacts on the wider economy. What are some of those impacts?
Right. So I think for an economist, it's actually a very interesting exercise because it refers to the very simple first-year textbook. So you have an economy which is a dual economy. You have a civilian sector, you have a military sector. So in the military sector, government spends pretty much fiscal resources, buying tanks and paying soldiers. Now, those soldiers go to Ukraine, get killed there, or go back wounded, maimed, and then you have to pay their families. Tanks get burned in Ukraine. And so for the domestic Russian economy, this military spending, which has gone up a lot, but from something like 3% of GDP to 7% of GDP. So this money is just injected as cash. So it looks like I produce a tank, but this tank is burned, right? So it's equivalent for the government just paying me cash, right? The same is with soldiers or dead soldiers' families. I give you cash, and the service you provide me for this cash is not a service that a teacher would provide.
Yeah.
It's a service which is of no use to me. This service is somewhere in Ukraine and the soldier is killed. So it's equivalent to the government just printing money, printing cash and giving it to military providers, be it soldiers or ammunition producers. And that is equivalent just to printing money, right? Yeah. Monetary emission, helicopter money, if you like. And of course, they're beneficiaries of the war. But overall, there is a huge inflationary pressure.
Yeah.
And this is why Russian economy has been so, the inflation in Russian economy was so persistent, and central bank has to keep the interest rate so high. The other issue is, of course, sanctions, which adds to the strain because Putin tries to avoid sanctions. He needs to pay intermediaries, and of course, it's also expensive. The other issue is just lack of access to advanced technology, which means Russian long-term future is undermined. So there are many issues. One of those is also demographic. About 1 million people have left. About 1 million of soldiers got killed or wounded. Russian labor force is somewhere in the range of 70 million. So it's not a trivial shock for the Russian labor force, which means major shortage of labor, especially in the civilian sector, because in the military sector, they pay high wages. These people work 24/7. So if you're a civilian entrepreneur, you face triple whammy. It's harder for you to export. It's harder for you to import good technology and equipment. It's harder for you to hire because wages are driven by the wages in the military sector or soldiers' wages. And it's harder for you to borrow because interest rates are so high.
Yeah.
And so it's very hard for the civilian sector. And whatever Russian statistics tells you civilian sector has been on the decline.
Yeah.
And living standards, especially in the civilian sectors, have come down.
Yeah. So you've got a big demand side stimulus coming in from all of this military spending, but it's actually, in some ways, it seems worse than just handing out money to random people, because handing out money doesn't necessarily destroy the supply in an economy, and here you're destroying people.
Exactly.
And also, lots of equipment and
Absolutely.
and that kind of thing. Okay.
I don't recommend launching wars to anybody. Actually, somebody like an economist like me, for an economist, it's actually an intellectual insult.
Yeah.
When we have so many problems around the world, that people start wars, kill other people who could have been productive, have happier lives, and destroying infrastructure, which was so expensive to build, destroying productive capacity. And this is so crazy. Then what we teach in economics is wars are destructive, counterproductive, and you shouldn't start wars. And it's not just a human tragedy for an economist; it's also an insult.
Yeah. No. Well, it's fascinating, because you do sometimes in popular imagination get a sort of weird, confused version of Keynesianism, where people sort of say, a war can stimulate an economy. Well, okay, in one sense, if you throw a load of money at people, they do have money which they can use to buy things, at least in the short term, but it's not what you want to achieve. You're trying to achieve greater human prosperity and happiness, which...
Absolutely, and this is an insult to Keynes. Keynesian theory was about the Great Depression, right?
Yeah.
When you have a lot of unemployed people, and indeed the demand stimulus, aggregate demand stimulus, was about bringing the unemployment back to normal.
Yeah.
Now, in Russia, you have shortage of people.
Yeah.
And so this is completely against Keynesian theory. And whenever people call this military Keynesianism and so on, this is just, again, follows from people not having read first-year macro textbook and insulting Keynes.
Yes. I don't imagine Keynes would have recommended the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Okay, we're moving towards the end of the interview, so I thought I'd just have a few final questions about Putin, and then some final questions about Russia and, the hopes for the future. On Putin, do you think he has any sort of economic ideology, or are all of his economic decisions in service of political or geopolitical objectives, do you think?
Right. In this chapter, The Failure of Putinomics, I talk exactly about this. Putin's been in power for a while, right? So the system he's built is probably the system he wanted to build. And so this system tells you something about what he thinks an economy should be like. So he believes in macroeconomic stability, and probably 1990s have convinced him that you want to run a reasonably balanced budget, and you want to hand monetary policy to an independent, competent central bank. And that's exactly what he's done. And with all the strains and challenges, Putin is still maintaining some kind of macroeconomic stability. For example, right now, as we are in the end of 2025, he's proposing a new budget for 2026. Those economic strains result in fiscal pressures. So what Putin does, he's raising taxes, right? So his ideology suggests to him, if I need to raise taxes to balance the budget, I should, right? So it's very clear that he understands the necessity of avoiding large fiscal deficits. And he knows that higher taxes will result in economic stagnation. But he also knows that running irresponsible macroeconomic policy will result in a meltdown. So this is part of his economic ideology. The rest is, as you discussed and as we discussed, he doesn't like independent businessmen who gain what they gain in the competitive market because they start asking political questions. And so for him, running an economy which is dominated by his friends or oligarchs who are loyal to him because they are afraid, this is the ideal economy. Crony capitalism is the ideal economy. If oil prices are going up, this economy can grow. If they don't, it doesn't grow. if actually you look what happened since 2012 or 2013 in Russian economy, the right way to describe it is stagnation, because oil prices were high, but they didn't grow anymore. And this economy could not deliver growth, because growth needs productivity growth, innovation, competition, openness. And Putin didn't like that exactly for the reasons you mentioned, because competitive businesses have political demands. And actually in 2010, we published, in this chapter that I mentioned, which we published with Oleg Savinsky, we call this scenario 70-80. We said maybe oil prices will recover. And it was 2009, 2010 when oil prices were low. And we said maybe oil prices will recover and Putin will be happy to avoid pro-market reforms. And that will bring us back to 1970s, 1980s. So oil prices will be $70, $80 per barrel, and Putin's approval rating will be 70 or 80%. But the economic model will be in 1970s, 1980s stagnation. And that's exactly what happened after 2012.
Yeah.
And in 2019 or 20, Russians' living standards were still at the level below 2013.
Yeah, so it's sort of repetition of Brezhnev era, with also the foreign Soviet Union, with also the same foreign adventurism as Brezhnev had. Yeah, like in Afghanistan, although Afghanistan seems to have been even less bloody, actually, than Ukraine.
Much less bloody.
Yeah,
much less bloody.
So 14,000 soldiers.
Yeah, something like this.
Yeah. So penultimate question was someone like Putin coming to power and staying in power in Russia, do you think, inevitable? Was Putin just a product of the institutions that were established or not properly established in the 1990s? Or is what happened basically a product of the man that could have gone in a different direction, do you think?
1990s did create an opportunity for somebody like Putin. Yeltsin could have chosen somebody else. It was a conscious choice of Yeltsin and his family. Some people would say these are the advisors, these are the family who chose Putin. But eventually Yeltsin was elected with a mandate to run the country. And if he chose wrong advisors, that was his responsibility, right? So if already he was sick and the choices were made by his advisors or his family members, it's still his responsibility because these advisors were not elected and he was. And in that respect, it was an important choice, the fork in the road, if you like, choosing somebody like Putin. Now, Russia is a big country. You don't need to choose somebody like Putin. On the other hand, Putin himself turned out to be a very smart politician who maneuvered and navigated this very difficult landscape. And initially, he would give speeches in favor of NATO. He was partnering with George W. Bush, fighting terrorism and supporting him after 9/11. As I said, in 2010, there would be a NATO airbase in Ulyanovsk within Russia. So all of that was all possible. And Putin, at any given moment, understood what needs to be done to stay in power. And he's been extremely successful at that. So he's one of the most skilled rulers. But it could have been a different scenario where a person would be more committed to long-term prosperity of Russia, which is not going to happen under Putin. And this person would be just more committed to rule of law, democratic values, and that would be a different outcome.
Yeah. Final question. You previously made predictions about how the Russian economy and politics would develop. If we are back here in 2035, could you outline for me what you think the most likely scenario is for what Russia looks like economically and politically in 10 years' time? And then perhaps what is the most optimistic scenario, the most optimistic, vaguely realistic scenario in your view?
Right. So Putin has rewritten a constitution in 2020 in a very legal way, but still, Putin believes that he can still be re-elected for yet another term in 2030, and by 2035, he would still be in power. Now, he will not be young, and who knows how healthy or sick he is. So if Putin is gone before 2035, that would be a scenario which in Britain is best described by the movie Death of Stalin. This is a comedy which is actually banned in Russia exactly for this reason, that it's too prophetic about post-Putin Russia. And so people around him, which Putin chose exactly because they cannot talk to each other, cannot run the country together, they will fight each other. Some of them will fall out of windows, and some of them may either try to build a very repressive regime, which I think is possible but unlikely. Russia is too big, too diverse, too educated. And Putin was unique in being able to build this repression. And also the repressive regime is not great for the elites themselves. This is what Death of Stalin is all about. This is what post-Mao's China was about, because the leadership said, we don't like too much repression because we suffer as well, right?
Yeah.
Then Xiaoping was repressed by Mao twice.
Yeah.
So it's not fun to live in a repressive regime, even if you're at the very top. So there could be some post-Stalin dynamic, and that could result in reconnecting with the West and eventually maybe some kind of perestroika 2.0, potential democratization. Russia is very close to Europe. Russians think about themselves as part of Europe. And so there is an opportunity of something like post-1945 Germany. Now, Germany was occupied by Allied powers, but Russia, while not being occupied, is not going to be occupied, wants to get rid of sanctions. And the removal of sanctions in exchange for releasing political prisoners, returning Ukrainian lands to Ukraine, that is a very important tool that the West can use. And eventually, indeed, if Germany has become a prosperous democratic country, why can't Russia? Now, it's not going to happen by 2035. Very unlikely. It takes longer than that, probably. But at least once Putin is gone, there is a fair chance that Russia starts moving in the right direction. Not becoming a democracy overnight, but that would be a process. Now, the most likely scenario then depends on what happens to Putin's physical existence and his hold on power.
Yeah.
Now, I should say that people think that Putin, as long as he's alive, he will be in power. Dictators occasionally get kicked out, eliminated by their own entourage, and you are never guaranteed against this outcome. So I don't recommend anybody to become a dictator. It's a very dangerous job.
Yeah. Well, on that very sound piece of advice, I think we'll have to call it a day there. If any of you watching have any thoughts or comments on whether it's a good career path to become a dictator, do feel free to write them down in the comments. In the meantime, also like the video, subscribe, and subscribe to our Substack, link in the description. But until next time, see you. And